If I was starting over in watercolor, I think there's a particular way that I would approach it. And actually, I think I'd use this approach whether I was starting from scratch, as in having never painted with watercolor ever before, or if I was starting over after a bit of a break, or one of those times when you feel like you've lost your creative mojo a bit, because let's be honest, that happens to all of us. I'm going to share the approach that I would use, but I also want to get really practical and talk about the steps you'd actually take when you get your brush out and put it to that gorgeous paper. If I was starting over in watercolor, I would do my best to paint like a 5-year-old. No, hear me out. Think about the joy with which a 5-year-old paints. You know, the secret is that they really aren't overthinking. Overthinking is kind of an adult thing. And it's because we want to do our best and we want to make sure we've learned what we need to and that we're doing things properly. But a 5-year-old doesn't think about that. They think about having a bit of a play, enjoying the colors and painting things that they love, whether they are good at it or not. That's what I think is the key here, because you really learn best when you're having the most fun. And it's not fun if you are constantly judging yourself. Painting like a 5-year-old is also about simplicity. And this is one of the things we love about watercolor. We don't need complicated supplies. Let's get that gorgeous paper, because that's the most important thing. 300 GSM cold pressed paper. I think a bit of texture is very helpful. And you really only need one lovely brush. A big fluffy round one is what I would recommend. And then some colors of paint that you love. Now, if you really are new to watercolor and you want some more information about watercolor supplies, I do have a free class that is all about that. It'll really equip you if you're off for your first trip to the art store, which is a very exciting place, but it can be a bit intimidating unless you know exactly what it is that you're looking for. And you can spend an awful lot of money on things you don't need if you don't really know what it is you're trying to achieve. So I'll put the links somewhere around this video so that you can check out that free class if it's something that would be helpful to you. The thing that makes watercolor magical is actually the water. I recommend having 2 big jars. One that you can keep with clean water and the other that you can use to rinse off your brush when you're changing colors. It's a great habit to get into. And since we're talking about how we'll be wanting to add water, you'll also want to be able to take water away. So have an old rag handy or a paper towel or something like that so that you can dry off your brush if you need to. Now, if your watercolor paint came in pans, dried in the palette, you'll probably need to give them a little spritz with water to bring them back to life. If you don't do this, you'll find it harder to get lots of that lovely juicy color. And that's what we want. We want to have a lot of fun with a lot of color. So if you've got dry pans, spray them with a little mister bottle and then give them a chance to settle for a little while so that that paint can spring back to life. If you've got paint in tubes, you can just pop out a little bit onto an old plate or a palette of some sort. An old plate will do.
Now, just how do you paint like a 5-year-old? Well, it's really just a question of tapping into that heady mix of joy and curiosity that comes so naturally to children. Let's use a nice juicy puddle of paint that we mix on our palette and just have a go at splashing it onto the page, not worrying about what we're painting. Let's just experiment to see what marks our brushes can make. And already we've learned the first technique of watercolor, which is wet on dry, as in wet paint on dry paper. And I'm trying it again with a second color. So I first rinsed off my brush in one of my jars of water so that it doesn't muddy up the color that I've chosen, which is a gorgeous quinacridone violet, one of my favorites. And you can see that with a nice thick mix, you get a really rich intensity of color. And if I use the tip of my brush, I can make all sorts of marks, and it's really fun to do that. Gives yourself a little bit of trust in your hand and the brush. Now look at my dirty water jar. You can really start to see how important it is to have those 2 jars, because just painting with the water, you can see what I've really got is a very dilute mix of paint there. And that means that that color is going to affect any of the paint colors I choose. So it's very handy to be able to go into a clean water jar and start with clean water anytime I need to, because water is very important in watercolor. And we can see why, because now in these wet areas, I can drop in bits of paint just by putting in the tip of my brush, I can make shapes, and I could just watch the effects happening here for hours. This is what I love to do, and this is where it's a bit easier to tap into your 4 or 5-year-old self and really enjoy these process, because you know, how much more relaxing can you get? The way that the colors, I've gone back to the earlier sections I'd painted, and some of them are still damp, and I'm dropping my quinacridone violet color into that green and seeing what happens. I'm also able to use the tip of my brush to pull out little marks, and I'm not trying to paint anything in particular here. I'm really just playing. But while I'm playing, I'm figuring out what the paint can and can't do, and I'm getting to understand the colors in my palette. You can see the green that I chose here is rather marvelous because it starts to split out into the blue and yellow that makes it up. So there's a bright blue that has appeared, which is really just part of that green paint. I mean, isn't that so much fun? And I keep experimenting with dropping in bits of water into my already painted sections to see what happens, because this is when you get one of those cauliflower marks which sometimes strike terror into the heart of a watercolor painter. So let's play a little bit more with this wet on wet technique. So I'm going to start by putting a bit of clean water onto my paper and then painting in a little bit of green. I can also control the flow of the pigments by tipping the paper, and some painters choose to paint at an angle, and if you play around like this you can decide for yourself whether this feels fun to you or whether you're happy to paint with your paper flat. Sometimes you can do a little mixture of both, and there's no right or wrong answer, but playing like this is how you figure out what's going to bring you the most joy and what's going to give you the effects that you like the best. When I dropped my colour into that wet section, it filled up, flooding all of the clear water that I put on my page, meaning I lost any of the shapes that I might have painted. But as it dries, I might be able to see a few more of those shapes remaining, and I'll be able to do that more the thicker the paint mixture is on my brush, and that's what I'm experimenting with next. I've got thick juicy green paint to put in those stripes, and you can see that they are staying a little bit more distinct. I can also take clear water and touch my brush with the clear water to the edge of the marks I've already made, and if some of them are still damp, the colour again will flood out and fill the space available. And I can join up my two areas with cold water and let the pigments decide how the colours combine. This is my favourite way of mixing colours because you get the most beautiful variation as the colours, as the pigments kind of blend into one another, and I far prefer that to mixing on the palette. Now we can also take paint away. We can do this on purpose to create a white area, or we can do this because we don't like what just happened. When you've got a sheet like this to play with, it's a perfect chance to just experiment and see how good your colours are at lifting out, because you will find that some colours stain more than others, and just having a bit of a play is the best way to learn the colours in your paint box. I know sometimes it can feel like a waste of paper to be using your good paper and your good paints just on a page of play and experimentation, but it's actually really important, because it's not that helpful if you're going to do all of this but use supplies that are different from the ones that you're going to be using when you're painting, because really this is what you want to see. You want to see how these paints react with this paper so that you can understand better. You can have a better chance of figuring out what's going to happen on your page. Now, another technique I love is a bit of splattering. All you need is juicy paint on the end of your brush, and when I say juicy paint, I mean paint that's got a bit of water in it, and you tap the end of your brush with your finger and you get this lovely random splatter of marks. It's one of my favorite ways to end a painting or to add a little bit of texture. And once you start playing around with this, and you can do it with the different brushes you've got, and you'll see you get different sizes of splatter. Now, I've been having so much fun with two colours. What if we added a third? And I've got this really bright colour called Aureolin Yellow, and I want to add a little bit of that. Let's start with a little bit of splatter. I love seeing how these colours react with each other. and discovering combinations in my palette that I really start to enjoy. I've got a bit of yellow on my brush already, and I'm mixing it into the little puddle of green that's on my palette to see how I feel about mixing the colour there rather than on the page. And when I strike it into the Cascade green that's on my page already, some of that's wet and it lifts up some of the paint that's existing that's still damp on the page. I'm able to make lovely marks with that, and I'm just letting my hand and brush do whatever it wants to do. I seem to be in the mood to be painting these sort of grassy shapes, and this again is where you let your childlike imagination out to play and see what you see in the marks you're making. And these are kind of reminding me of foliage, but it's also making me want to see what I could paint just using the shape of my brush. And I'm thinking petals. I suppose it's also because I've got that lovely bright yellow on my brush, and I'm thinking if I turn my brush around, I can put petals in a row. I'm also softening off the middle of what could be a little flower shape there, just by taking a damp brush and running it against the edge of the paint. That's another useful technique that I'm sure I'll be able to use in painting that I'm really just discovering by playing and experimenting. Now, I love my quinacridone violet, and I want to drop a little in the middle there. I'm testing and experimenting to see if I can get a thick enough mixture on my brush of the violet colour that it doesn't spread out, because if you put very watery paint down, it'll whoosh out into the other colours, but if you make it quite strong, it'll stay where it is. The other thing I'm doing, which I think again is like tapping into your childlike self, is not worrying that I haven't made a perfect circle there. I'm just making shapes and I'm seeing what's to come of them. Clean water or very dilute paint can push the pigments on the page out, and what happens is you get this lovely mark that's made when the pigments settle at the edge of the little water droplet. So I'm experimenting with that to see what effects I get. Some people get quite upset with them when they happen, but I rather love them, and I think practicing them like this when you're playing and there's no stakes involved is one of the best ways to get comfortable with that sort of thing, so that you no longer have to feel like you can't control watercolour. I don't think you should control it. I think you should just collaborate with it. Now I want to experiment a little bit more with the idea of taking paint away. So I've torn off a bit of my kitchen towel, and I am using that rough torn edge to soak up some of the water and pigment in different areas. You can pull shapes out depending on what you use to lift out the colour and the pigment. So it's a good thing to have a bit of a play with, so that you can do it a bit more confidently if there's a particular shape that you want to pull out of your image. Some of the first marks I put down are dry now. Those green lines stay exactly where they're put when I put a little bit of this yellow over the top of them, and that is called the glazing technique. Now, yellow is a lovely light valued colour, which means that it's usually going to be the most transparent. Now, watercolour, in my opinion, should be transparent. You do get the odd colour that is a little bit more opaque, but my favourite ones are the transparent ones. I'm having a little play to see how I feel about the quinacridone violet. That's naturally a darker colour, and you can see that it almost covers some of those green marks that have dried on the page. Where there's a little bit more water in the wash, you start to get a lighter film of the quinacridone violet, so that becomes more transparent the more water you add to it. So this is another useful technique that we've kind of stumbled upon in playing, and really it doesn't matter if you know the names of these techniques. We paint for fun, so all you want to do is get comfortable with how the paint and the paper work together and figure out what sort of pretty things you could put on the page. My page is nearly full, but I just want to put a little bit more yellow in the corner. I think I'm going to have a go at practicing the softening off technique, where you put down a mark and then with a clean brush that is slightly damp, you just tickle the edge of it so that it loosens up one side and lets the colour spill out, which makes a lovely soft edge. So this is a chance to see that we can put both a hard edge and a soft edge in quite easily just by understanding how the water and paint work together. My page is pretty full and I feel really quite excited after having played with all this colour. The next question is what to paint, because this is all very fun, but we want to make an actual painting. Would you like to hear and see my favourite watercolour painting subjects that are especially good for beginners? I made a video all about that. It's sharing my top 3 subjects and it's full of ideas and examples that will get you painting today. I'll pop it on the screen so you can watch it next. Happy painting!